I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. In a moment, we'll talk with veteran journalist and one-time Times colleague Seymour Hersh. His latest book, a memoir called Reporter. It should be required reading for anyone thinking of becoming one or anyone who takes the art and craft for granted. We'll also discuss another extraordinary week with my Times colleagues on the backstory, and I'll offer some additional thoughts on Coda. But first, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh's latest book, Reporter, a Memoir. It's just been published by Alfred A. Knopf and reviewed in this past Sunday's book review by Alan Rusbridger, former editor-in-chief of The Guardian, now chair of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Somebody once told me the difference between a reporter and a journalist was a journalist got to put his own byline on a story. These days, they're put on automatically by the computer. So with all the columnists, the correspondents, the commentators nowadays, are there any reporters left in the business?
Oh, come on, of course. There's a lot of good reporters. I was just on a panel in Florida last week at a journalism convention with Matt Apuzzo. And I will tell you this, he'd done so much homework. I was saying, my God, he's actually one of the people does investigative reporting for the paper now. He was hired from the Associated Press, I think, and he spent years there, as I did. And I said, I think maybe being the AP is a much better training ground than even the Harvard Crimson. I mean, because you really get your nose into the ground and you chase stories. I was a police reporter. I don't know if Matt was, but somewhere you learn the great lesson of journalism, which of course is you're only as good as you read. If you read it before you write, you're in business, and that's something that a lot of people at the Times does. But this guy, he was in the process of reading a 518-page Inspector General's report that had just been published, that I had yet to read. I downloaded it. So on the other hand, you're only as good in a way as what you did yesterday too. So that's true.
That's your record, and people forget it pretty quickly. Read before you write. That's one of your mantras. But you said the two deadliest words in the media world today are I think that.
I was talking in terms of look, when I was at the Times in '72 for 7 years, Watergate, Abe Rosenthal, it was halcyon days. I remember vividly, money was never an object. You could do what you wanted to. And Punch, who I didn't know that well, but I knew Sidney Grusin. I loved him and adored him. Jim Goodale. Mm-hmm. I knew those people very well. And my understanding was there was a cap on profit. You know, there was just a cap. It was just the Punch, the old man Sulzberger, he didn't want to make more than 1.5% or 2%. You know, there was a cap. The rest of the money went into the paper. And when you think about it, there's no such luxury today. And there's a money issue. And although the Times is doing quite well with online subscriptions, but there's nothing like the subscription I have is you have my credit card. I'm the golden subscriber. I'm the core. There's about 700,000. Somebody once told me the number. And I'm the backbone, and the rest of it is much different. Scrambling for money. The Times. One of the great stories I wrote for the Times was in December 1974 about domestic spying, and I happened when I was doing this memoir, I went back and looked at the paper. That paper that Sunday. 574 pages.
Doesn't happen anymore for the most part.
No, for nobody. I mean, everybody's skimpy. So it's a different world. And the other big thing, getting back to your line about I think, we didn't have cable TV just running everything pell-mell. There's no distinction between something that comes, we have a president that can, in a 10-minute conversation, could deny saying something he said in the second minute. Do you know what I mean? So what he calls fake news is a lot of it he generates with his inability to remember what he said and lie about what he does. But everything that the White House says goes immediately in any tweet goes immediately on cable news. It's never examined, never considered thoughtfully, and it's a 24-hour cycle we didn't have. And I think what I meant by that line is, cable has panels. They have all these panels, and they ask a question. Usually, the questions often are asked a very astute question a good editor would ask, and the answers are, since everybody's on television and has to say something, they all begin by saying, "I think."
It used to be where Meet the press asked the question of an official rather than asking the question of the press.
Now you got a big distinction. Maybe we're just old timers and we like the old way better. There's always that possibility. But the idea that, and it's also reporters commingled with political operators, and when I was at the Times, even with a good story, I would never go out of my way to go on television. We'd go and Face the Nation on Sunday when we weren't working or something like that. But the idea of running during the day to a studio, a network studio to go on, wow, you just didn't, I mean, it would have been like silly. It would have been just considered to be just strange. We just didn't do it.
That's a whole different world. And you say it's painful to think that you might not have been able to accomplish all you accomplished journalistically if you were at work in today's chaotic and unstructured journalistic world. So how is everybody going to do the kind of work that you did?
Well, you know, our old newspaper, I say ours, my old newspaper, that was the last newspaper I worked for. They're still doing investigative reporting quite a bit. They put a lot of money and energy into it, and they're long takeouts, and they're now doing photo takeouts. You get page, which is sort of a whole new, all very interesting. All the idea is trying to appeal to the broader audience, the audience that may not read as much as the audience did in 1972. Everything's so fast. I don't know. The answer is, I would tell you, instead of saying I think, if I'd been on those panels and they asked me a question, I would say, how in the hell do I know? I don't know how I would have done. I still think there's a high quality journalism, but I was taking weeks and weeks, you know, and stories. Some came very quickly, but I never had Abe Rosenthal, for whom I worked, who was mercurial would be a calm word for Abe, and I was sort of mercurial too. We had some terrible fights. I'll tell you my favorite Abe story. Do you want to hear it?
Sure.
I was the little star boy, and he hired me basically I was at the New Yorker actually. I'd done My Lai, and I'd won all those Pulitzer and all these prizes. And I'd written a lot for the Times Sunday magazine, which was, in those days, very serious. It was a great magazine, but not so much, not for the paper. And he invited me to join the Times, and what his message to me was, go to Washington and make trouble on the war. He never made a judgment about what he thought of the coverage except to say what he said to me. And so I went, I had a great time, and Watergate happened, and the Times was behind on Watergate, essentially because Henry Kissinger kept on assuring us there was nothing there. We listened to him much more than we should have. We, the editors, did. I'm sure Abe was going crazy about that. And he always saw things in terms of Ben Bradley. Ben's getting all this attention, and I know I'm doing a better paper and much smarter. I mean, so anyway, in '75, my wife, decided to go to medical school and had done pre-med stuff and was accepted to NYU, and we moved. So I'm coming to the New York Bureau, and we're moving in late August and early September, and we have a place, but you know how New York can be. There was a garbage strike. Garbage was piled up to the second floor, and a teacher strike. And my wife had to start med school before Labor Day because they started in late August. And so there I was, and we had a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. We hadn't got a housekeeper yet. The school, I thought they would be in school. And so the first day I was supposed to start after Labor Day, the kids came with me to the Times. They rode the subway happily. My daughter had a crayon book, my ball. My 7-year-old had a ball. He was bouncing a ball. And we get into the Times office, the downstairs on 43rd Street, the big foyer. Just as Abe comes about 9 o'clock, he usually came at the same time, it turned out. And he walks in with Arthur Gelb, and he says, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, Abe, don't worry about it. We're just a little crazy." And anyway, I'm coming. I've got an office there behind the sports department. Remember the old building on 43rd? Sure. And I've got boxes to unpack, and the kids will be fine, and I'm just going to get organized. Oh, no problem. Didn't say much to the kids. We go, and about an hour and a half later, my daughter's drawing and my son is involved in a major, serious kickball game with the other 7-year-olders in the newsroom. That is the sports department. They're playing for to kill.
Yep.
I think Tony Conhurst, I remember, was there. And in the doorway is Abe. I look up, and there's Abe. And even then, when he was edgy with me, which happened more than once, he would say, "Seymour." So he says, "Seymour." I said, "Yes." He says, "So let me ask you this question." I said, "Sure. Do you think on that fateful day," and I'm telling you this word for word, on that fateful day 2,000 years ago, if Mrs. Moses had said to her husband, "You got to stay home today and take care of the kids," would the waters have parted? I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. The guy wore his heart on his sleeve. He was a great editor, but I'm sure glad I wasn't his publisher.
That's great. You can read a lot more stories like that in Reporter, a memoir by Seymour Hersh. It's just been published by Alfred A. Knopf, 2 glowing reviews. The backstory is next. Welcome back. And what kind of week has it been? Hellish for thousands of people seeking freedom and the untold millions who grieve for them. Locally, some good news for those who want to smoke marijuana with less of a hassle. Former Mayor Mike Bloomberg spending $80 million to help elect Democratic Party candidates nationwide. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my Times colleagues, contributing writer Clyde Haberman, national political correspondent and CNN political analyst Alexander Burns, and Sports of the Times columnist Michael Powell. Michael, you have not been with us for a while. You've been off covering national news. You've been off covering sports. So here's your opportunity to talk about 2 of your old friends, Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani. Looking from afar and looking from a long distance in terms of time and place, what do you think they're up to?
You know, Giuliani, I mean, start with there. I mean, I thought that Giuliani was sort of I used to cover him as bureau chief at City Hall back when he was in full possession of his senses. And he was a formidable cat to cover. I mean, you know, had many battles with him. There was a sense of somebody very much in control, even of his bile. I mean, he had his bile. He used it as a weapon. Now there is, in looking at him, a slightly unhinged quality. Like he's just, like he's as if he's so happy to be back onto the stage, but he hasn't played it in a long time. And it's really, I think he's played, I would think, and I guess I would kind of hope that the Rudy of 1995 would be embarrassed to see the Rudy of 2018. And as for Trump, I always saw him, I used to cover him as sort of part of the tabloid press in the 80s and the 90s as this kind of Mad Magazine developer, right? Kind of a joke, kind of a swagger. What he's doing now, and particularly in the last few weeks, the way in which, as the Washington Post and the New York Times have, amply demonstrated the kind of lies he tells day after day, and they're not just simply misstatements, they're not, fibs. They're just outright lies and about very important things. And then to refer to, to immigrants and this sort of thing, and the way in which he is, I don't know, it's hard not to feel my own bile just kind of overtaking me. So it's been, a surprise for me, having covered him in the day, is the extent to which he's willing now and even eager to just poison the well, to take kind of rat poison and just pour it in there day after day, and that's a surprise.
But are you surprised at how many people are embracing that as well?
Well,
a lot of people.
Surprise is, disgusted is really, I think, the more operative word. Rudy, I was asked to go in after the Republican convention in 2016, and Rudy gave this madman performance, America, what's wrong? He was absolutely nuts. I was asked to go on CNN to say, whatever happened to him? And I said, you don't understand. He's nuts. And now he's sycophantic nuts. To watch him, deal with this president in this way. He clearly has no idea of how he's widely viewed, certainly in this city. This is not an isolated, left wing, blah, blah, whatever they want to call it. As for the president, this business, I mean, he shows his true character with, which is not a good one, with this business of the trial. It's the family separation stuff. A word I can't get out of my head now, it's several days later, where he talked about these people coming over the border to infest our country. That word alone is already, I'm sorry, it's fascism. It's the way the fascists talked. The Nazis used to talk about Jews infesting the country. The Greek generals who were finally ousted in the 1970s talked about leftists infesting and had to deal with them as if they were cockroaches and so on. This is the language of despots. I'm sorry, it's not just, he's not adept at languages. He's not. He's got the, we know he's got the vocabulary of a backward middle schooler. That must be the White House calling. Right. But really, when you start using this kind of language, you're on very, very, very fine people territory. His neo-Nazis, he found very fine territory.
I mean, you've covered him. Do you think he believes this, or is it a political tactic?
I guess at some level now, I'm willing to credit him with believing this. I mean, the surprise for me when he was elected was there were many problematic aspects. I am surprised, and I guess I'd be interested in Alex's take on it. I'm surprised at the ideological nature, at how ideological his and how nativist and how vitriolic. I always thought, his whole idea that he's the man of the deal, this is a guy who's committed, endless, kind of serial bankruptcies and stuff. So I didn't really take it seriously, but I sort of figured that would be more of his shtick. Mm-hmm. And this frankly surprises me.
Alex, what do you think?
No, I think that's right on. I think a lot of folks in Washington expected, the big fear on the Republican side was that he would come in and just bargain away the farm to Democrats so that he could get favorable coverage. I think Democrats were concerned that he would come in and be sort of, for voters, like shockingly reasonable compared to the man they saw in the campaign, because they thought that he had no fixed views on anything, right? So if somebody could come in and offer him a big win on healthcare that involved, creating a single payer system or something, who's to say he wouldn't do it? And that's not the president we've seen, right? That what he has done is basically just try to cater to and excite and enrage the most passionate, angriest segment of the electorate that supported him, which is far less than the number of people who actually did vote for him. There's a big block of people who voted for him, disliking him as they did it. He's not really doing anything to try to make those people feel better about their choices.
And he's absolutely abusing the language. In another tweet the other day, he talked about his denuclearization deal with, his words, with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. There is no deal. There is a few statements on paper. Most people who analyze this think actually Kim, swept the floor with him. But there is no deal. But he's now using this language, oh, well, we have a deal. You have nothing.
But is this the big lie? If you say enough times we have a deal,
well, that may be.
And we're not blown up, and Kim doesn't attack anyone that people think there's a deal?
It's good that, we're not going to get nuclear attacked, and maybe South Korea won't either. That's fine. But when you're saying, it's the big lie, well, yeah, the guy who said that was Joseph Goebbels. This is not a good model.
But this is also part of what's so striking about what's happened in the last couple of days with this policy of separating families on the border, that it is the rare instance where the president told a lie that he couldn't sustain even with his own party, right? That even the people who have given him cover on so many other deceitful statements that he's made wouldn't go there on this one, and ultimately had to back down. And so you have this incredible contrast of just in the space of really hours, him going from saying, this isn't a policy I can change, Congress has to act, to changing it with the stroke of a pen. We've not seen that really happen before.
Alex, when you talk about a base, and Clyde and Michael, that he has to go beyond in order to get reelected, and yet he's appealing to that solid, radical, if you will, base. doesn't he know he has to go beyond that? Doesn't he know theoretically he has to become more moderate on positions to win those independents or whoever they are somewhere in the middle?
You know, I don't think he does, because we all said that during the 2016 election, and his advisors told him that during the 2016 election, and he won the race anyway. And, you know, he won it for a number of reasons that don't have to do with his sort of great political ability. I think there are big questions about whether that model is replicable. And it's very possible that what we'll see this November is what happens when you take that approach to politics and you don't have Hillary Clinton as a foil to use against you. That's what scares Republicans about running on the same ticket as the president. But as for him, this is not a guy who's run for office before. This is not a person who particularly understands what public opinion data means or the mechanics of campaigning, that he's just sort of this big celebrity messenger who talks over mediums that were very powerful 30 years ago and retain power with a certain segment of the electorate today, but he's not somebody who has sort of a great intuitive grasp of the way politics works.
But he could still say, hey, I didn't listen to you and I won.
Right, and that is, we can't say he can't win again that way, but we can say he's the only one who ever has won that way, and trying to do it twice is a big risk he didn't need to take.
Mayor Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg, committing $80 million. Is that a lot of money nationwide for congressional races? And why all Democrats, which seems a little bit unusual for Bloomberg, who often makes bipartisan endorsements?
It's a ton of money nationwide, and it's a ton of money especially because he doesn't plan to spend it in 435 races. Right. He's planning to spend it in 10, 12, 15 districts where the idea is to go in and drop $4 million against one lawmaker after another. Overwhelming force was a term that his people used a couple times in the course of reporting that story. It's a big deal that he's doing it just for Democrats. He has tried to split his money in the past, really to the great exasperation of people who share his views on issues like guns and climate and immigration. And it really is a reaction to the president. It's a reaction to just seeing, what he said in sort of confirming this plan was, one-party government doesn't work, and it's clearly not working in this case.
And I think also, if I may, I don't think there are any Republicans on the national level who a guy like Bloomberg can support with his politics. They have all moved very far to the right.
One of the shocking things has been to watch people like Susan Collins and others who you would think, that there's been any number of rub points where you would think these people would split off, and
but
by and large has held.
And they don't, Jeff Flake or Bob Corker, they'll complain, but then they vote down the line.
What kind of national reaction has there been to this, and how would it compare if David Koch put $80 million into races?
Well, it's actually one of the tricky things for Republicans in responding to this. I asked a number of Republicans if they wanted to comment in advance of the story about Bloomberg putting his money in, and they were all hesitant to do so because many of them have taken his money in the past. So he's not somebody like Charles Koch or David Koch, where the Democrats are very, very happy to just demonize them. That if Republicans start demonizing Mike Bloomberg, then a lot of their candidates are going to have to explain, well, what are you going to do with that $15,000 that he gave you over the years?
And does this suggest that he might this time be interested in running himself in 2020?
I think there's no question that he's interested in being president. He's told people that for years. He's not doing anything right now that we're aware of that's actively preparing. It's a tough thing to report about because obviously someone with his resources and he has basically an in-house campaign at all times. He could decide tomorrow to flip the switch and do it.
2016,
how old is he?
He'll be 78. 2016, he didn't run because he
That's
thought he couldn't win. Could he win in 2020 as of now?
Well, the reason why he didn't run in 16 is because he felt an independent couldn't win, including him. He's talking now about if he ran, he'd run as a Democrat. I think there are big questions about whether a guy who sort of sided with Goldman Sachs over Occupy Wall Street and implemented stop and frisk can win a Democratic primary.
Thanks to my Times colleagues, Clyde Haberman, Alexander Burns, and Michael Powell for joining me, and I'll have some additional thoughts next. Superimposed on a photograph looking south from Billionaires Row on 57th Street, the headline on the latest cover of Harper's Magazine proclaims, "Death of a Great American City." Inside, the estimable Kevin Baker writes, quote, New York today, in the aggregate, is probably a wealthier, healthier, cleaner, safer, less corrupt, and better run city than it has ever been. He sheds no tears for the Dickensian 70s, but he laments contemporary poverty, homelessness, empty storefronts, and absentee apartment owners. And he describes the city as the world's largest gated community with a few cupcake shops here and there. Today, Baker writes, life in New York too often seems like a sci-fi version of itself in which we barely notice as our fellow human beings are picked off by the monsters living among us. No doubt New York needs help, but this wouldn't be the first time that sci-fi predictions of its death had been greatly exaggerated. As Professor Max Page wrote in his book, The City's End, there's been a long line of disaster scenarios that, in their own weird way, actually seem to celebrate New York. As far back as 1824, hundreds of gullible New Yorkers were hoodwinked into believing that overdevelopment would tip Lower Manhattan into the Bay. By the early 20th century, change was such a constant that Henry James was disparaging New York as only a provisional city. On seeing the skyline for the first time, H.G. Wells was said to have declared, "What a ruin it will make." And remember that New Yorker cartoon of Godzilla and King Kong nonchalantly strolling in Midtown. They pass by scenes of mayhem as Manhattanites flee before them. "Let's face it," the scaly monster tells his furry friend, "the city's in our blood." In the 1951 Cold War classic, The Day the Earth Stood Still, an alien, the kind from outer space, arrives to try and save us from ourselves. A terror-struck cabbie pretty much sums up the prevailing mood as the city panics and fears obliteration. "My old lady was right," the cabbie says. "We should have gotten a place in the country." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.